Thank you very much, and thanks to each of you for your contributions. I suppose just at the outset, just to say that we are playing catch up in this area, and we have an ageing population. You've mentioned my own area of Fingal, which happens to be one of the younger, but within that area itself, there are ageing towns, and I want to return to the supply and what we can do to plan that. Firstly, if we could just turn to the HSE, which is specific questions, non-housing related. But if you look at the housing adaptation grants that are there, which are useful, is in relation to how you may look in conjunction with the department of prioritising those applications based on need. And what I mean is we've all come across cases, and there are many, of people who remain in hospital because their home isn't adapted and they can't be discharged. Now, a make simple solution to that is, if the medical need is there insofar as that you cannot be discharged because the work has not been done, a shower or wet room or whatever it may be is not in, it doesn't make any sense to me that we're not actually giving a direction. Now, I know you'll probably need the assistance of your colleagues in housing planning and local government to do that, but I think we should look at that. I think actually not we should look at it, we should do it. I'd also ask you from the HSE side of things about occupational therapy reports. What's the turnaround time at the moment, or your average turnaround time in processing a needs assessment or an occupational therapy report? Again, with a lot of the housing adaptations, that's actually required. You need to go into an existing house and see, well, what is needed to let Dara O'Brien out of hospital to be able to live independently. But that varies from county to county. It varies from area within local authorities. So if we want to actually, do some practical things where we don't need conferences or relaunches of this, that, or the other, let's see what we can actually do on the ground. So I'd like to know what our turnaround times are in that area, and do you feel, either Mr. Redmond or Ms. Spillane, that we're well resourced enough with occupational therapists in each of the areas in an ageing Ireland to actually process all this work that's required? Is there another way of doing it? Maybe that it's done privately and that it's paid for then by the department? Do we have to wait for OTs, HSE appointed OTs to complete these reports? And it is a big problem. So I think that would be that. I think in general terms, I was very glad when Mr. Tynan mentioned on behalf of Mr. O'Mahony earlier on was that downsizing is not a bad word. But I think it has become a bad word because of the ham-fisted way in which housing for the elderly has been approached in some instances, not in all, but in particularly when we look at terms like bed blockers, people feeling bad that they're still in hospital, or when there's been announcements by government about housing strategy, about, well, you've mentioned in your that we've 900,000 more family homes than families, but when government have tried to approach that, elderly people and more seniors have actually felt it's nearly like, I should be getting out of the house that I've paid for, my family home, so I should be leaving. And I think one of the reasons why you would get 89% want to remain in their own home is because there are no alternatives. And if there were alternatives, and I'll maybe talk to yourselves first specifically about this, if there were alternatives and choice, I think people would look at them. I speak for my own parents who are seniors as well, who have recently downsized, and it wasn't a bad word for them. It's actually made a lot of sense for them. But one area I want to touch before I get to the department specifically for yourselves, you mentioned, and I think very rightly, however, there are no options for those who are above the financial threshold to access social housing but don't have sufficient means to support their older age accommodation needs. That's screaming out at everybody. What would you do from an RIAI perspective with regard to the local authorities? Would you insist upon it being in development plans? You look at mixed developments, mixed unit developments. Could you tell me where it's done well? I've seen a couple of places where it's done well, but I'm nearly sure it's been done well. Not specifically that apartments have been said there for elderly people. I don't think it should be that. I don't think it ever should be that. It should be a mix of duplex, semi-Ds, apartments and open settings whereby people see other people. I actually happen to be fortunate enough that I know a few areas like that, and it works really, really well. So a mix, a community mix. So maybe if you had, from an RIAI perspective, 3 things that were doable relatively quickly, what would you do? And I do want to turn to the department on a couple of things, if I may. and I thank you, Ms Hurley, for your statement here, but I was struck by it, and maybe it's the focus from the department, that the delivery of social housing is really important, and social housing for the elderly. But can I ask you, there was talk about examples of a couple of schemes which are like semi-independent living, and I get that, but in general terms, about housing mix for local authority or social estates, are you guys setting the mix at the moment for the new estates which are being delivered right now? I know one's in my own area, Fingal. Are you actually saying, well, look, we're giving 10–15% of those aside, we're going to design them that they're designed for life, so they're designed within the estate for young families, elderly people and those in the middle? So I'm wondering what direction are you actually given? Are the department, and through the planning element of it, and maybe building control, Ms Neary, I'm not sure, is with the AHBs as well? I've seen a couple of magnificent schemes being delivered by the St Vincent de Paul Housing Trust. I've seen one in particular in my own town, Malahide, St Benedict's, which is being extended. But do you know the demand from people for those extra 16 units? There are hundreds of people looking for them. And it puts the housing association and the local authority in an absolutely desperate position, where it's a Solomon's choice nearly, you know, where people are desperate to be able to look to alternatives. So what's our split? What do you actually think we should be delivering per annum in this area on actual targets? Can I ask as well about you're talking about the joint statement, and I think the joint statement is important. What's the statement, without giving us a sneak preview, what do you think it's going to say? Like in real terms, what are you trying to get at, and will that be backed up by policy? Of course, a report will come along with it, I'm sure. Reports are reports, but it's actually the actions therein. So, you know, I think I'm sort of jumping back and forth, but I'll try to stay within the 5 minutes. Is the number of elderly from a HSE perspective that you believe, have you any statistics on how many seniors are actually in inappropriate accommodation, insofar as that they're in hospitals, that they're in long stay in hospitals because of the fact that their homes aren't appropriate for them, or because of the fact that they're waiting for occupational therapy reports, for housing adaptation grants? Do you track it per local authority, basically, that to say, well, here's what Fingal are doing, here's what Roscommon are doing, what's their turnaround time, how can we drive it through? Like, I welcome the fact Deputy O'Dowd did earlier that we've 62 million, an increase of 11%, but, you know, what are we getting for it? Is the service actually improving? So, just to conclude finally, and with the department, and maybe Mr. Tyne and Mr. O'Mahony will come in on this one as well. The best practice that's out there in Ireland, is there a local authority that you would look at for both private and public housing? Probably not. Is there? There isn't, right? But maybe say the best of possibly a bad bunch, without being unfair, and I don't want to be unfair, so I don't mean that. But where do you see there being a better focus now on actually trying to deliver proper housing mix? It was really interesting, the figures that you gave about increasing densities, you know, on existing areas, and actually, you know, making them into communities. There's a role for us politicians in that, and local politicians as well, because you try to increase densities anywhere, you'll find that there'll be a furore from existing residents saying, you can't do that, that's a lovely field in the back there, I like that car park, or whatever it is. Okay, so it's about actually getting a proper mix and people getting real about this situation. Because what I would say, Cahirley, and I conclude on this, is like every aspect of housing, like, these are ticking time bombs, and I hate to say it 2 weeks in a row, but they actually are. But we can deal with this with proper planning, proper design. I'd love to know, are the department instructing local authorities for private developments? And I think you have to. I think you have to actually be able to say, more mixed development, whole of life developments. Okay, so are we going to instruct them by way of planning guidelines to say to the local authorities, when you're putting your development plans together and your planning bibles together, your guidelines, this is what you must do? Because the private sector are going to have a major role in it. You're not going to solve it by delivery of social housing. So it's the people as well who have the 3-4 bedroom family home that's paid for, that don't want to be there anymore, but will stay there because there's nowhere else to go. So I'll conclude that. Thanks.